Okay, so we are going to talk about a few things related to writing about data. This is going to cover what we call data paragraphs, or the parts of an article or a report where we have to talk about the data, where it came from, things like that. And at the end, I'll also review some of what we've talked about related to writing about visualizations. So, when I'm writing an article or a report, when do I need to talk about data or records? Okay, so there are a few different times that we'll do this. We'll do this when a specific claim relies on data or records. So maybe you have an entire article, and in one section you need to pull one stat from that you got from a data set. We'll talk about how to do that. We'll also talk about when large portions of your article or report draw on data. So maybe the entire first half, maybe the entire article, maybe your entire report draws on data. And then we'll talk about times when you need to say something extra if what you did was unusual or notable some way. And then, like I said, we'll cover visualizations really quickly. So the things that are important are for the reader to know where the data came from, who collected the data, and who analyzed the data potentially. And we're going to go through when do you need to say each of those things. But this is what you need to be thinking about. All right, so a specific claim relying on data. We're going to treat this just like we treat like an indirect quote. Okay, so provide the source of the data or records in the same way as you would attribute an indirect quote, according to data collected or obtained from some organization. 25% of mice have one ear. Okay, so just like if I was saying, according to university president Johnson, 25% of mice have one ear. According to data obtained from the United Nations, 25% of mice have one ear. Really simple. According to data obtained from this organization, this. Example from the New York Times. Okay, so the claim here is that there have been at least 11,780,800 cases of the coronavirus in Brazil, according to data from state governments. That's it, okay? According to data from this place. If you are working with data that was collected by someone else, okay? So, according to data collected by Greenpeace, 75% of reptile species face extinction in the next 15 years. Maybe Greenpeace got the data from a bunch of different sources, a bunch of different state governments. We got the data from Greenpeace. Greenpeace collected the data. We're just going to say, according to data collected by Greenpeace, this. So when do we need to say more than that, right? So far, what we've been talking about is just this is where I got the data. But sometimes, if the process of gathering that data is relevant to the story, then we need to say that. Okay, and these are going to be unusual situations. All right. I asked the Department of Public Services for this data. They gave it to me. Cool. I don't need to say anything other than that. But here's an example from the Texas Observer. Now, in response to a nearly year-old public information request, an internal ICE tally obtained by the Observer reveals that ICE nabbed 132 immigrants in the Austin area, nearly triple the number previously reported. Okay, so something unusual happened here. We don't want to just say, according to data obtained from ICE, this. It's actually relevant here that it took them almost a year to respond to this request, and that the number that they report is triple what they had previously reported. Okay, so this is what we do when everything is normal. We just say according to data from X, or according to data collected by X. When things are not normal, that's when we might need to say a little bit more. Okay, so let's go on to the second case, and this is when a bunch of your article is going to draw on data, or maybe you're working on a report and that entire report is going to draw on the same data. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to write a paragraph that explains what the data is and anything relevant about it, and we're going to kind of let that cover the next bit of the article, okay? So we call these data paragraphs. Sometimes data paragraphs are the lead, right? You might start the article by talking about that, or it might come right after the lead. Sometimes they start a section that's all going to draw on that data. Sometimes they are in a sidebar, something like that. But basically, we're going to say all this about the data, and then we're going to assume that relevant claims that come afterwards are backed up by that data. So I don't have to keep saying according to data obtained by X. Okay, so let's take a look at how this looks. So ProPublica article on climate change. And their lead is, according to new data from the Rodian Group, analyzed by ProPublica and the New York Times Magazine, warming temperatures and changing rainfall will drive agriculture in temperate climates northward, while sea levels will consume coastlines and dangerous levels of humidity will swamp the Mississippi River Valley. Okay, so we're going to assume that claims that follow this about climate change, right, temperatures, rainfall, are coming from this data, and it's data from the Rodian Group. And here we also note who analyzed it, just because that seems relevant in this case. And it's also kind of giving credit to the New York Times Magazine here. All right, so really simple. There's not much to this. And in a lot of ways, this functions just like a claim, right? The claim is warming temperatures and changing rainfall will drive agriculture in temperate climates northward. We're saying according to, and we're going to assume that down here we're using the same data. Let's see. Here's a bit more extensive example. So this is ProPublica. And we have a lead graph here. As protests erupted around the country in late May, police departments seemed to respond with more violence. In the ensuing weeks, hundreds of videos, protests surfaced on Twitter and other social media sites, often drawing outrage and in some cases swift disciplinary and legal action. Now we're going to go into the data paragraph. ProPublica wanted to find out what happens after these moments are caught on tape. We culled hundreds of videos to find those with the clearest examples of officers apparently using a disproportionate level of force against protesters, and reached out to 40 law enforcement agencies about the 68 incidents below for each incident. So here, what they did was not journalism as normal, okay? They had some data, they selected some data, they had a reason to select the data, they then went out and reached out to some agencies. So this explains what everything that you're going to read and see in the following is based on, okay? So it's more extensive than something like this because what they did is different, it is more out of the ordinary. So here's another example of a long and more detailed example. And here these two paragraphs are explaining where they got the data in this process. And so if you're interested in this, pause the video, read it. But the reason that we have so much information about the data here is because, one, it's telling you when you read this story, this is where all the data came from, I'm telling you, but also because this is not journalism as usual. All right, and that's it. So what you need to remember about data paragraphs and attributing the data is that if you are just attributing a claim, you're going to do it like an indirect quote. You're going to say, according to data from X, according to data obtained from X. If you are working on an article where a lot of the information is coming from the same data, you're going to write a slightly larger paragraph that explains what the data is and where it came from, and then we're going to assume that relevant facts are coming from that data unless you say otherwise. Other than that, the only important things are where did the data come from, and then what is there anything unusual about the process for obtaining it, collecting it, analyzing it. If you are not doing journalism as usual, you need to say it. Otherwise, it can usually be left unsaid. All right, visualizations. When you are working on visualizations, you are going to include a few things. First, we want a declarative headline. What I mean by a declarative headline is it's a headline that declares something. It is like a sentence. It has a subject, a verb, it makes a claim. And generally what we're doing there is we're telling the reader what to take from this visualization. Okay, this is the main point that I want you to get from that visualization. Sometimes we have a subhead, again, declarative, and this is just any secondary points that we want the reader to take. You don't have to have a subhead. Sometimes they're good, sometimes not. Sometimes we have a non-declarative subhead. That just means that maybe there's additional information the reader needs to understand the visualization. We'll look at examples. Sometimes we have a legend. This tells me what the colors represent, and we'll look at that. We do want a caption. Captions are any additional information needed to understand the visualization, okay? So is there anything that you did that the reader needs to know in order to understand what's going on? And then a source line, that's where the data came from, and a credit is who made the visualization. So let's look at examples. So this example has a declarative headline and a declarative subhead. So Texas turnout hit 66 of registered voters, which is the highest since 1992. It's my declarative headline. This is what I want the reader to take away from this visualization. In Texas, at least 66% of the 17 million registered voters cast ballot. Going on, going on, going on. This is more information that helps me understand the main point. But again, this is declarative. It is telling me something, okay? Here's the legend right here, the green box and the yellow box that tells me what the colors mean. Really importantly, that needs to make sense to readers, okay? Visualization software might label these things, but you might need to relabel them in order for readers to understand. This does not have a caption, so what I take from that is that there's nothing that the reader needs to understand other than this to interpret the graph well. We have the source, Texas Secretary of State. Data from the 2020 general election was preliminary, and the credit line is who made it. All right, let's look at an example of a non-declarative subhead. So presidential approval ratings have gotten more partisan. It's declarative, that's a sentence. This is what I want you to get from the graph. Approval ratings in February of a president's first year in office overall and by partisan affiliation since 1993. So looking at this subhead, there is no verb here, there is no action, I'm not making a claim, I'm just telling you some additional information about what you're looking at. Source, Gallup, no credit on this, that's kind of based on the publication, but as students we want you to put your credit line there. Another non-declarative subhead, nothing to talk about here. We can talk about the caption though. Evangelical Christian population based on 2010 U.S. religion census data excludes districts from North Carolina and Pennsylvania due to post-2016 redistricting. So that's a good example of kind of like a minor point that you might want the reader to know in order to understand this. I took out some data. I filtered the data in this way, something like that. So here's an example of a time when we would use a non-declarative headline. And this is not going to be terribly relevant in this class. We want you to usually be using a declarative headline because we want you to be telling the reader, this is what I want you to understand from this. But basically the headline here is like turnout in this county. Okay, not declarative, doesn't have a verb, doesn't tell me anything, but this is a visualization where I can change the county and I can kind of explore. So the story in Hays County might be different than the story in Travis County or Bayer County. So we're not going to use a declarative headline there. We're just going to kind of label it and say this is what it is, and we're going to let the reader find their own message, their own story from within that. Another example of a non-declarative headline, new confirmed and probable cases reported in the last 2 weeks. Okay, no verb there, but again, we're going to let the reader explore and find what they find relevant. Let's see. This is just another example of kind of a long version of a like a data paragraph or a data note that just goes into a lot of detail here because these COVID numbers were so complicated, but you really want readers to be able to understand and draw conclusions from them. There's things that we could talk about. So here we have a non-declarative headline, but if I was writing a story about what happened to the unemployment rate when we had the first statewide shutdown in Texas after 2020 when COVID was starting, I could change this declarative headline. And if you want to pause the video, think about what that declarative headline might be. But it might just be something like unemployment rate jumped from 4 to 12% when the Texas statewide shutdown was implemented. Something like that. We could do the same thing here. Again, if you want to pause, practice, but these are non-declarative headlines that need to be declarative. But that is everything you need to know about writing for visualizations. And the main thing being declarative headline, making sure that all the words on the visualization are written in a way that the reader can understand them without specialized knowledge. There's no like column titles or weirdness in there. And that is writing about data.